So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our plenary speaker today, Helen Tiger-Flussberg. Helen's been doing amazing work in autism and language and communication disorders in general for a while now, and is one of the few researchers who's really focused on minimally verbal and low verbal individuals with autism to try and understand what's going on and what might differentiate this group from other people with autism. She is professor in the departments of psychology and brain sciences, of anatomy and neurobiology, and of pediatrics at Boston University, where she directs the Center for Autism Research Excellence. She has a long history of continuous funding from NIH. She's published over 200 public papers in peer-reviewed journals and chapters and books and many other things. So we're really honored to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you all really for inviting me to come and speak here. It's just such an honor to do so, and it's exciting for me to be able to focus a talk now exclusively on the minimally verbal. So I'm going to start with Isabel Rapin, from whom I had way more to learn than I realized, even though our work on language impairment in autism closely paralleled one another for so many years, but I really didn't pay as much attention as I should have over the years. And I just want to give here a couple of quotes, and the second one I'll be coming back. Language disorders of children on the autistic spectrum have much in common with those of children with developmental language disorder. And here, Isabel is referring to the group of kids who do speak, but who are delayed relative to their peers, and in different ways, using different methodologies and approaches. The profoundly impaired expressive deficit, and here I think she means the minimally verbal, is postulated to be at the level of retrieval of the commands for verbal expression. And she notes in this paper, as well as in several others, that really we don't know much. But her ideas, I think, are very profound, and I'm going to come back to them at the end of my talk. So when we think about language in autism, which, as Lisa didn't note, it's not a core symptom of autism anymore, but we know that it's quite variable. There are about a quarter who don't have a language impairment in structural language. About half do have this co-occurring kinds of developmental language disorders. And today I'm going to be focusing on this 30% about who are minimally or nonverbal. So why is language so important for us to be thinking about, even though it's not a core symptom in autism? Well, language is the primary means by which we do connect with other people, and how we understand other people and what's going on in their minds. It's a major tool for learning. Once children acquire language, that is the way they learn. It's the key to self-reflection and self-regulation. And when you have good language skills, particularly as a child or adult with autism, you can use language to compensate for other cognitive or social systems that may be impaired. And importantly, it really is the single best predictor of future outcomes. We here think about it as predictive for autism, but actually for all of us, language is the single best predictor. So I started this journey actually going back. Well, I didn't really think I was studying minimally verbal at the time. I had an ongoing study of 160 toddlers, which I was doing with Alice Carter back in the day. And Rhiannon Leister came and was looking for a summer research project and decided, let's look at behavioral predictors of language in this large group, a very large group of toddlers who were basically 2 when they entered the study. And we investigated a whole range of predictive variables, behavioral predictors, that we had different measures for these, and these had all been identified in the literature. Imitation, gesture, play, joint attention, nonverbal cognition, motor skills. And in fact, what you can see here is all of them, all of these behavioral factors correlate with both receptive and expressive language. But what we found was that when we did multiple regression analyses, the gesture was the single highest predictor of language. Communicative gestures are an important precursor. They actually entail joint attention, and also motor skills are involved. So gesture, in some way, these are not sort of uncorrelated or completely independent variables. And we think gesture turns out to be the most predictive because it combines several of them. And then what I did was to go back now and ask, well, when I looked at those 160 toddlers, some of them did make significant gains over time, but some of them did not. And I wanted to know what really differentiated at the age of 2, who would make gains over the course of the next 2 years and who would not. So selected this group of 50 children retrospectively, 25 of whom did make gains and 25 of whom didn't, and asked what were they like at the age of 2. Importantly, there were no differences in their age, in how many males, so there was not a sex difference in who made gains, or in how much intervention they were receiving over the course of that 2-year period. But these were the variables where we did find differences: nonverbal IQ, motor skills, the Vineland social, which is kind of pretty general measure, and imitation. And I'll be coming back to imitation later, and the other variables here later in the talk. But this was all in toddlers going into the preschool years. And those 4-year-olds who we didn't follow afterwards, it's always impossible to get funding to continue to follow longitudinal samples. Some of those 4-year-olds may still have made significant gains, but others would not. And we don't know in that sample who, but we tend to think about the minimally verbal as the group who, by the time they're entering school or kindergarten, are still minimally verbal. So who are they? Well, they're a highly heterogeneous group, Just because we identify them as a subgroup based on their expressive language, they're enormously variable. There's no single set of defining characteristics. We've looked at comorbid psychopathology and comorbid medical conditions. They all have multiple ones, but they're different from one child to the other, and certainly etiologically, though it is estimated that a pretty significant percentage will have identifiable genetic mutations. It is a significant challenge to assess them, Current measurement tools really don't have much in the way of known validity or reliability. And so when we embarked on this journey to really study this minimally verbal group, we focused quite a bit of effort on developing those approaches to how we could assess them. Based on work done by Pickett and his colleagues from Hopkins who combed the literature, you can start speaking after the age of 5. It's rare, however, and almost every case in the literature was, they started speaking after 5, well, it was, though, before the age of by 7. And there's only one case after puberty, and that's exceptional on lots of grounds. But as Sophie noted, there's really almost no research on this group. I want to highlight here, this is based on our current sample, quite a large cohort, that although you can see here their expressive vocabulary, this is parent report number of different words, is pretty much centered around 0 to 10, you can see that their receptive vocabulary is much more broadly distributed. And there's a lot more variability there. And I'll note here that Isabel Rappin comments repeatedly that receptive skills really do differentiate different subgroups across the autism spectrum in terms of their communication disorder. So we were very interested in and worried about how do you assess receptive language, and this is work with my colleague Daniela Plaza-Square, and this is kind of where we started to figure out what are the best methods. And so we had about a sample of about 20 children and adolescents, and we compared a bunch of approaches, both standardized and experimental. And we had the ubiquitous PPVT, even though, of course, some of the kids don't even achieve a basal on this standardized test. We had a parent report word list, a vocabulary interview of receptive, eye tracking, where we're looking at how they respond to spoken words in a completely you don't have to understand any instructions to do the task. You don't have to say or even point. We just use their eye gaze. A touch screen computer responding to spoken words. And then as another standardized measure, we put in the violent communication subscale, but unlike the other measures, this doesn't just tap vocabulary. We worked very hard at adapting testing approaches and creating environments in which we could optimize the performance of our participants. So both for the eye tracking and the touch screen, the participant would see 2 pictures and they'd hear a word, look car, and we'd either see whether the child touched the car on the screen or whether they gazed longer at the picture of the car while it was still up there. I'm just showing you here, we know nonverbal IQ can be very low in this group of minimally verbal, and it was quite variable in our population. But what I'm highlighting here in blue and red, we see the Vineland receptive communication and the Peabody scores. And in black, we see their nonverbal IQ scores on the Raven's matrices. And you will see that across this group of younger children, and the data look exactly the same for the adolescents, in every one of them, their nonverbal standardized standard score is significantly higher. So it's not just about IQ, okay? Even though you will still see many people saying this in the literature. We did validate our experimental measures. They correlated significantly with the Peabody. The Vineland didn't, but that's not a vocabulary measure. But I think the most important point that I can make here is that there was individual differences in which method did the best job in assessing language in each of the 20 participants. It's a small sample, but the variability even within that was important. So one child might show they understand words through eye tracking but not touch screen. Another child, their eye tracking data may not be systematic, but their touch screen and their Peabodys might be. So let me move now into the main part of my talk, and the question that really is the one that hooked me into wanting to study this population. And that is to ask the question, why don't they speak? Okay. Now, there's many potential cognitive and neurobiological explanations. I'm going to tell you right now, the punchline is there's more than one reason, and there's variability about why different children are not speaking too. So we're not trying to find the answer, but we're identifying the multiple answers that I think explain why these kids don't speak. Lack of motivation, they don't understand the fundamentals of intentionality in communication, may have symbolic deficits, imitation, intellectual disability, language learning mechanisms, the capacity to process sounds and speech, or specific linguistic and speech motor movement factors. And I think we have evidence for all of these variables being predictors of spoken language impairment in this minimally verbal population. Let me start with the behavioral correlates, where we picked up with older minimally verbal children what I had done with Rhiannon Leister with the pre-verbal toddlers, and that is to look at a whole bunch of behavioral measures that we had. And here we were just predicting to expressive vocabulary, and this is the work of my doctoral student, Meredith Pekukonis. And we looked at initiating behavioral regulation, joint attention, play, imitation, IQ, and age, because we had 43 children and adolescents who were widely varying in age, but who met the criteria that they were minimally verbal, which means on an objective level assigned to Module 1 of the ADOS. Okay, well, we did not find that initiating joint attention, behavioral regulation, or age was a significant correlate, but the others all were. And importantly, our social communication variables responding to joint attention, play, and imitation remain significant predictors even after you accounted for nonverbal IQ. So we do have some behavioral predictors, but they account for significantly less than half of the variance. So this is clearly not everything that's going on. It's not about just more severe autism, if you will. So what else is contributing? Well, I'll talk about two main lines of work. One is processing sounds, particularly in so-called complex environments, and then go on to talk about speech motor impairments, or, quotes, apraxia of speech. Okay, and I'll put in number 3 here, which is that there are clearly other factors that we have not focused on at this point, so they're yet to be discovered, and I'm hoping that I'll stimulate some interest in all of you to begin to pursue this. And I have to say that it's, I think we feel that we've made some traction, some inroads into this field by actually looking outside the field of autism for potential answers, for potential methods, and particularly for potential computational models that have been developed in the basic auditory and speech neurosciences, and bring them to bear, even though they weren't developed with autism in mind. But how do these foundational computational models help to enrich our understanding of this aspect of autism, the failure to acquire spoken language? So let me start with auditory attention, and this is work that I've been doing with my former colleagues, I have to say now, unfortunately, Barbara Shin-Cunningham and La Wang. Barb has now moved to Carnegie Mellon University, and she's an auditory neuroscientist who's done a huge amount of research and talks about how sounds themselves are organized into scenes. We certainly understand the visual world in that way, but in fact sounds are as well. The more you can segregate the multiple sounds, right now you think you're just hearing my voice, but actually there's lots of other sounds going on, but you can still follow my voice because you're pulling it out of the ambient sounds out there, okay? And this is a lovely illustration that Barb, a visual analog, that when you color code the words, they're so much more readable than when they're all in a single color, because these are not segregated. So this is a visual analog of what we mean by segregation. So in this experiment, we were using ERP to simply ask, how do you perceive sounds? Can you pick out an oddball sound? It's a very classic paradigm. And the trial structure, we had 3 different types of trials. You just hear a single stream of sound, and one of them is a deviant. In this example, it's louder, but we actually counterbalance, and on the other half of the trials, it's quieter. Then we present it with an overlay of sounds at a different frequency, but far enough apart that most people can still detect the deviant, okay? And then in the integrated condition, where the overlaid sounds are so much closer and much harder to pull apart, in most cases, it's impossible to detect the deviant. Now, many of these kinds of experiments are done using psychophysical methods, and you ask a participant to listen carefully and press the button when they hear the oddball sound. Well, sorry guys, you can't do that with minimally verbal. Everything we've done, we've had to adapt the methodology. And so we've adapted it, and other people have done this, where you simply do it as they're listening to it, and the detection is done using event-related potentials. And what you see here is, here's Emily, and she's actually watching her favorite movie, Frozen, while it's on a silent movie, of course, while the sounds are playing in the background. And we did this experiment with 3 groups of adolescents, typical verbally fluent and minimally verbal. And here are the findings. The blue is the detection of the deviant in the oddball condition. The red is detecting it in the integrated condition, and we're looking at amplitudes here. And this is in the segregated condition. And while we actually see the typical participants a little bit more, I think what I love about this graph is the variability, the individual variability. And in fact, we did not find any group differences when we looked overall, okay? But what we were most interested in is question of, is there any functional significance of being able to detect the oddball in this segregated condition, especially in the kids with autism. And so we looked at the relationship to the P-body, to receptive vocabulary, and we did not find a significant correlation for the typicals, for the verbally fluent, but we did find a significant correlation in the minimally verbal. So in the segregated condition. So the ability to detect sounds in a noisy scene is associated with better receptive language, but it did not track with expressive language in this group. Of course, expressive language, by definition, is very truncated in a minimally verbal sample. So some of the variability that we're seeing in this population is certainly related to just very foundational auditory attention skills. And let me move on now to the second class of explanations that we might have. And this is getting at the question of, and the idea's sort of been bandied around for a long, long time, that kids with autism have, or some of them have, childhood apraxia of speech. And this has been looked at both in verbal kids as well, but not really in minimally verbal, interestingly enough. So there's a definition, is speech movement precision and consistency are impaired in the absence of neuromuscular deficits. That's the Asher definition. And by saying it's not neuromuscular, it's not a question of low tone at the peripheral. This is a central disorder, and it's considered to be very rare. And when Larry Schreiberg has looked for evidence using pretty sort of consistent and reliable and valid tasks to measure childhood apraxia, he has concluded that in verbal kids, they don't have the prosodic impairments, for example, that are characteristic and are not a kind of form of childhood apraxia. But nobody's really looked at this. I mean, it's kind of a challenge. How do you look for childhood apraxia? You've got to have some speech to be able to identify it. But my former doctoral student, currently my postdoc, soon to move on to an even more illustrious career, Karen Chinowski, has really taken this on full force. To ask the question, do some minimally verbal kids also have this co-occurring CAS? Okay, so in a pilot investigation, we've been collaborating with Gottfried Schlaug, who's doing a really intriguing intervention with minimally verbal children called auditory motor mapping training. And so what Karen did was to take 38 children who'd participated in that study, and the criteria for entry is fewer than 20 words, no phrases, but can repeat at least 2 speech sounds. So they don't have much language, but they are able to repeat speech sounds. And as part of the treatment study itself, they get these 2-syllable words, and they have many opportunities to repeat it. And it's because you have this opportunity to repeat that you can get some of that variability, that each time the child says the word, their precision is different, and that's core to the definition of CAS. Okay? And then you just count how many signs of CAS do you see. And these are the signs that Karen looked at that were developed by Eugenie Siegel and Jordan Green and their colleagues. And I won't go through all of them, but they're, a good speech scientist can detect these. And here's what she found. She found that if you use the diagnostic criteria for that Eugenie Siegel, had at least 5 different signs from that list, shown at least once on any word. Almost every child in this sample actually met this criteria. When she used a more conservative criteria, that the sign appeared at least 3 times on any one word, almost 2/3 met criteria. But here's the catch. It may well be that, in fact, the entry criteria for this study was biased towards selecting kids with CAS. And so we really don't know how true this is of the broader population. So taking a broader look at speech motor disorder, Karen's moved on now to take an unselected group of much larger, 57 minimally verbal, with a wider age range, and coded features of CAS in the child's responses on the Kaufman Speech Praxis Test, which is a standardized assessment that we use as part of our protocol. And then she looked at the relationship between speech motor deficits and expressive vocabulary as used in a natural language sample that the child naturally used in conversation. And here's what she found. And what we see on the left is she identified 4 groups. Here's a group just under So this is the blue is the N and red is the percentage. Okay. So just under a quarter of the sample did not seem to have any speech motor disorder, which means that more than 3/4 probably did. Here she finds it's just under a quarter who clearly meet criteria for CAS. So it's significantly less than in that pilot sample because they're unselected. But then there's this almost a third who have some other clear speech motor disorder, but not quite CAS. And then there was a significant group who didn't produce enough speech for her to even be able to code, were they showing those kinds of distortions that are signs of CAS. You have to have some speech to do that, and they didn't have enough. And we might want to assume that their speech motor disorder is so severe that they can't even produce a minimal number of words. Okay, so, and then what she found was that about a third of the variance, which is pretty high compared to the other kinds of multiple regressions I run, in expressive vocabulary was accounted for by speech motor ability, and that's across the whole sample. So, so in this group, clearly their expressive language is severely, the majority but not all, limited by a speech motor impairment. And I'm going to end now. I don't remember. I haven't kept track of time, so, and I can't see you over this. I'll just talk a little bit about what might be the underlying mechanisms. And this is work that we have been valiantly trying to do with my colleague Frank Gunther, and that is to peer inside the brain, okay, of minimally verbal kids and adolescents. And of course, I don't need to tell you that the challenge has been to be able to obtain even decent quality data from this population if you are not going to sedate them, which, you know, in theory we could have, but in practice we did not. Okay. Now, Frank is a world-renowned computational neuroscientist who has developed probably the most sophisticated computational model of speech production. And I'm not going to go through it all. It's called the DIVA model. And there's both feed-forward and feed-backward. You can see it's a very complex network that's involved in speech production, something we all take so completely effortlessly, okay? But is not in the least bit in that way, okay? He was particularly interested in this connection, in the feed-forward system between how do you take the representation of what you are going to articulate and turn that into the speech motor movements themselves. So this is a very important tract. It's highlighted here in orange, okay, connecting the supplemental motor area with, in the left hemisphere, with the ventral premotor cortex. And what they found in an early study, but this was all verbally fluent individuals, but with variable levels of fluency. So they're verbal, they're linguistically okay, but their fluency varied. And what Piva and Frank and his students all found was that using DTI, they found that this tract was more impaired, was narrower than in the neurotypical comparison group, which I think you can probably just even see by the naked eye, but of course analyzed statistically. So I will say this, as the criteria for reasonable DTI data have become more stringent, And this sort of happened over the course of the 6 years we were doing the study. You know, when we began, I think they said, well, if the kid doesn't move 5 millimeters, we'll be okay. And so we did that. Oh, no, now we're down to 2. No, now we're down to 1 millimeter movement. And then we threw up our hands and said, well, that's it. We haven't got anyone that we can do DTI with. But we did get a few minimally verbal adolescents in the scanner to do a word production task. And the task is totally tailored to the words the child could name. So they don't have to have a lot of words. But if they see a picture of a ball and can say the word ball, and we train them to do that, then we put them in the scanner and we collect fMRI data. And we've done this, of course, with some controls and with, these are verbal adolescents with autism. And what you see here is this very nice activation pattern in that region, SMA to prefrontal motor, the motor areas there. And, but there was more variability, in fact, although group-wise there are no differences, that even among the verbal kids there was more variability in the activation pattern. And here I'm going to show you the scan of a single minimally verbal participant. And here's what's striking is we don't see any activation at all. I mean, even in the right hemisphere, okay? And what instead, I think there's significantly more activation in the posterior regions. So they're able to produce a few words. These are still minimally verbal, but they clearly are relying on fundamentally different underlying mechanisms, and their whole speech production network seems to be distinct, except, of course, I'm only showing you an N of 1 here. So going back to Isabel's prediction, I think what she's saying here in terms of retrieval of the commands for verbal expression is a rather eloquent way of describing the speech initiation system in the brain that Frank Gunther has highlighted as being important, and that seems to, in fact, for which we are beginning to see some evidence. So to summarize, I do think multiple factors are associated with speech and language impairment in the minimally verbal. Imitation is a key behavioral predictor, but joint attention, play, and IQ are important. There's poor sound segregation in some adolescents, signs of CAS and severe speech motor impairments, as well as in the neural mechanisms that underlie speech initiation. So where do we go from here? Well, there's lots of uncharted territory. I think we need to continue to search for the neural bases of the profound deficits. I think being guided by these kinds of computational models is an excellent direction to take. I don't think we should be giving, I didn't talk about the treatment research, and there are some very promising lines of treating and showing improvements in language in kids over the age of 5. We must not give up on treating them. Most of these kids are not getting any speech and language services at all. They say, well, not speaking at 5, that's it. We'll try something else. And I think we need to be focusing on building interventions that map onto the specific profile of impaired mechanisms that I've talked about today and others that are yet to be discovered. This is truly a group for which personalized approaches to intervention are going to be the key to improving their lives. Let me give my acknowledgments to my funding agencies, my collaborators, and particularly the children and the families participating in the projects. Thank you for listening, and this is our team as of October in this year back at Boston University. Thank you.
Ellen, that was a very eloquent series of studies and speech. You know, the interesting finding with the supplementary motor area is relatively easy to target that with TMS, and you can easily activate that region. I don't know whether you've thought of that in conjunction with other communication enhancement.
You know, I think it would be fabulous. I agree with you completely. It's something we've flirted with, but the challenge of actually doing this work is more than I've been able to take on quite at this point. But I agree. I think that might be quite promising.
In the minimally verbal patients that you had did the MRI data, do you have access to subcortical auditory regions, and do you see differences?
In the minimally verbal, you know, I don't know. I don't. I haven't seen anything on that from this project. I don't think they were looking in those areas. They're very focused on their cortical speech production network, and not so much on the subcortical. What we did find was that at the, you know, through the brainstem levels, we didn't find differences in perception and hearing. So that was intact in the group that I showed you from the electrophysiological experiment. But certainly one would want to. There's so much, you know, we've done a tiny bit, we've scratched the surface, so to speak, of the brain.
Thank you, Helen, for the presentation, and it's like doing with a very challenging population. I'm very curious about the effort you took, heroic effort you took to scan these children. I'm just curious if you scan them awake or during natural sleep.
Oh, no.
And the second question I have is, and what did you do to prepare them? Because this is like really important for the field in imaging. That's the next challenge that we need to really address. And the second question is, given this, both the behavioral data and some initial imaging result on the motor cortex, I'm wondering if there is any evidence in therapy, like speech-language therapy intervention integrating fine motor skills approach. I know anecdotally therapists do that, but what is there any systematic evidence to show that this may be helpful somehow?
So in terms of preparing, so we did not do it during sleep. And I have to say, I think the challenge for us with this particular study was that at the time we were doing this, we did not have a scanner at BU, which is where the participants were used to coming. And instead we were doing this at MGH in Charlestown. And if anyone has been there, it is not the friendliest of environments, particularly for kids, for people with disorders. It's not really set up that way, and it was a huge challenge. These kids need multiple visits, and then 3/4 of the way through the study, you know, in their brilliance, they took away the mock scanner. So, you know, that just turned into being a challenge. Now we have one at BU, but I think I'm giving up on it. It was too hard. It was really just too hard. So we don't do it when they're asleep. We do lots and lots of preparation, but I think it's Chris Nordahl at the Mind Institute has written, I think, a wonderful paper on how to prepare minimally verbal kids for scanning. That's the one. That's who I would look for that. And of course, we do preparation. We've written up our procedures for preparing for electrophysiology. It all sounds simple in a, you know, when you can run by that, but each participant takes a huge amount of time and effort and preparation. So, and then you asked me about therapies that focus on fine motor. I know nothing that's been done in that area. And in fact, motor altogether. So there's the prompt therapy, and actually the group from Australia, including Karen Chinowski, just wrote a Cochrane review of interventions for minimally verbal. They did this whole systematic review. There were 2 studies that met their criteria, and they, you know, nothing showed anything, because people have just not done RCTs. They've just not done it because, you know, we took seriously this idea, well, if you don't speak by 5, you're not going to, and that's it. Why bother?
Thanks, Helen. What are your thoughts on augmentative communication for this group?
Augmentative communication? So this is basically relying on something other than speech. I think that's a huge untapped resource. I say it's untapped. I think there's lots of stuff out there. We've looked at this somewhat systematically, and other groups have. Almost none of the kids in our study had access to, let's say, a tablet through which they could communicate. Almost none of them did. And if they did have one, well, you know, somebody had introduced it in the school, and maybe it's occasionally taken up. It's not systematically used. The parents aren't using it. So that's what I mean by untapped. And yet Connie Cassery published this wonderful RCT, a really fantastic one using a very sophisticated clinical trial design, and showed that if you combined a treatment that's known to improve social communication skills, it targets joint attention, play, imitation, the behavioral predictors that I talked about earlier, and you combine that with giving the kids a speech generating device, you saw significant improvements in their communicative language. So I think that's a huge untapped potential. Thank you for bringing that up.
Let's thank Helen once again.